thing anybody had ever seen before.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm not willing to say aliens, but I am willing to say UFO.
And I would follow along with that. It does. And that was one of the very things that I had thought of. Is it smacks very much of being an Area 51 kind of situation. Something's being tested. The tower doesn't know about it because it's top secret,
Right.
and something happens. Whether it's the pilot of this unidentified plane makes a mistake and causes him to go down, or he gets distracted and panics, and something goes wrong.
They have to abduct
know.
him because he's seen it now.
Yeah,
So
they're gonna go
just
that
had to
route.
take him, yeah.
They had
Or,
to.
Actually, maybe they just used a disintegrator beam on him.
Yeah, maybe.
You don't know that they abducted him.
Well, and everybody says, well, it must have been an alien and they must have abducted him straight from the airplane. And then, so that's what the noise was when he was being brought in, for lack of a better term, with the tractor beam. Yeah, it was his plane making all this noise, or
As
interference.
his body was pulled through the middle of the plane.
Or as
the
his
tractor
plane was
beam.
pulled into the craft. I don't know. I mean, it's funny is when I read the transcript, this is a little dorkish of me, and I admit this, but the description of it, do you know what the first thing I thought of when I read the description of the aircraft that he described?
No.
Do you remember back in the 80s the
No.
Disney movie Flight of the Navigator?
No.
No.
It was Flight of the Navigator was a kid in the late 70s who was quote unquote accidentally abducted by a sentient alien ship, and he has this crazy adventure, and it sounded so much like it to me what I remember seeing in that movie.
I'm so sorry to tell you that you've just aged yourself.
I know that I've aged myself.
Yeah, really.
So has time.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
So it's all that
all right.
booze.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now
Same
here's-
for me.
Yeah, so here's the other weird things is, of course, as the story broke out, a ton of people came forward with reports of having seen something along the coastline, lights in the sky that didn't make any sense with all of these reports.
Of course.
Yeah.
I say the same thing.
Which
Of
came
course,
first?
everybody, chicken,
The chicken
and
and
the
the
egg.
egg. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Except that in some of the sites, and this is the problem sometimes with these sites, is you don't know how good their research is. Some places were saying at least a half dozen to 10 of those reports happened prior to him taking off on the flight.
I also think I read somewhere that there was a guy who set up a tripod
Yeah.
on the coast.
Yep,
And
and-
was taking pictures, and there would have been no, it was as he was flying. It was 20 minutes before he disappeared or something, right?
Yes, and those are known as the Manifold photos.
Yeah. So,
Roy Manifold.
but so the pictures showed something, right?
Yeah, they do. And I looked them up, and I was
did
very...
you actually find copies
I
of those
did
pictures?
find copies of one of the two photos. So here's, for everybody who doesn't know, Manifold was 20 minutes before Valentich took off. He went ahead and set up his tripod, and he set it on a timer for his camera to take 6 photos of the sunset going down into the ocean. Everything was fine. He went and got the film developed, and photos number 4 and 6 supposedly show some kind of craft rising out of the ocean and then taking off. I can only find on the internet photo number 6, the one that shows this funny, weird, blurry object, which I've got to be honest, looks like a beetle or a gnat with its wing in motion to me.
Do you think maybe something landed on his lens?
I wonder, except that they say
be.
photo number 4 had something coming out of the water, and I can't find that photo.
Yeah. So what I read when I did read about this was that they sent the photos to a bunch of different people who analyze photos for a living. And some that specifically were people who validate UFO photos. There are people who are like, yes, this is actually a UFO. So they're kind of, pro the whole UFO thing. And they said, we can't tell. These photos are blurry. It's an old camera.
Everything was
It's
kinda out of
like
focus.
It's into the sun. It's kind of like crappy quality.
Do you think maybe
can't tell you.
if it wasn't a UFO? Do you think perhaps it was the Kraken?
the Kraken.
It could have been the Kraken, dude.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. So, right there.
So-
UFO. That
Yeah.
is the number one go-to explanation that you will find whenever you do any searching around. And there are, I kid you not, a dozen other crazy UFO stories. And I don't mean crazy as in somebody's nuts, as in, wow, where did this come from kind of stories that are connected to it, saying that he's shown up 20 and 30 years later and now he's living in Spain and he hasn't aged. But that's the internet. That's the hard part.
Yeah.
The internet is just rife with, I've read some of these things and it sounded like the Sci-Fi Channel movie of the week kind of thing. And as we've said on this show before, I don't poo-poo the fact that there's got to be something out there. I'm
Sure.
not going to say that there isn't. Some of these stories I think are a little far-fetched and I think somebody might have written on. So
On that note, hi alien overlords coming to take over.
Oh, yeah?
hello, nice to meet you.
No, I think that the only reason that I would give this, like, my big problem with saying, oh, you know, he crashed or, oh, you know, any kind of like, you know, really reasonable explanation is that they, like, planes don't just disappear into the sea usually.
Well, actually, they can.
I mean, they can, but usually there's like some wreckage, right? It doesn't just like cleanly all sink down. There's something floating, or I assume there were like floatable things in. So the only reason that I like can understand why everybody says, yeah, he was abducted, is that as far as I understand it, they didn't find any trace of anything happening.
That's not exactly correct.
Okay, see, so, and this is why we're
So here's a couple of things that I did come across.
Okay.
First off, when the initial search and rescue was going on, they did one of the search planes or boats, it doesn't specify which, found an oil slick that appeared to be aviation fuel.
Huh.
Now the
But
problem
didn't
is,
that turn out not to be aviation fuel?
well, that's the problem. I have read both directions, that it was and it wasn't aviation fuel. So, again, this is over time. This happened in 78, so we're talking 35 years ago.
Yeah.
And these things get kind of mucked up as time goes on. Here's the other thing. 5 years after he disappeared, in that strait, the wreckage of a Cessna was found, and it had partial serial numbers that could be recovered that were similar to his, but it wasn't a full serial number of the plane, so they couldn't say this is definitively his plane.
Okay.
That's that model of Cessna. I'm pretty sure probably most Cessnas and most light aircraft like that are designed to be able to float for several minutes before they go down, so that you can get out.
Right.
They're a light aircraft. They're not super heavy. The other problem is the current in that strait is pretty strong, and it's very likely that if the plane hits, floats for a couple of minutes and gets caught in the current, it's not going to sink straight to the bottom.
Yeah.
It's going to
It'll
get
be
pulled sideways
Be swept
as
well
it
out to
descends.
out to
Sure.
sea, and
Yes.
then wind up somewhere
But
towards
what
New
about,
Zealand.
I assume, like, were there, like, flotation devices or, like,
There were
beacons
Yeah.
or anything like
Yes.
that? And those things are designed to escape from an airplane when it crashes and
survive a
Yeah.
crash.
float right up to the top.
I
And
don't think the beacons are designed to escape and float, though. I've been in small airplanes, and usually the beacon
maybe
is
not.
bolted in.
Okay.
Yeah, the
usually-
beacon, the black box, I think is
Yeah.
what you're talking about.
No, they have beacons too, which are basically radio beacons. That are there's the ones that I've seen have a toggle switch on the top, which is an on-off switch, and then they have a little rail above that with a weight on it. So when you go smashing into a mountainside or whatever, that weight slams forward and toggles the radio on.
Trips it on.
Yeah, but those ones that I've seen are securely fastened.
Sure, you know, all of my experience with water beacons is on a ship, so
Yeah.
that's more made to float.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess I just assumed they were all like that.
Yeah, but those are the only things that were found. That's the hard thing, is that there's one spot of fuel and partial wreckage found 5 years later that
Yeah.
is not a perfect match.
Huh.
Well, then we go on to the other theories.
Okay.
Because there are other theories.
So,
here.
There
like,
are
reasonable
indeed.
theories?
Like pilot error.
There are, and pilot error is indeed the next theory that we've got. Frederick wasn't an experienced pilot.
Yeah, as you said.
He was a very young pilot. Here's a little backstory on the young man. He had applied to be in the Royal Australian Air Force, or the RAAF. He wanted to fly for his country's Air Force. He took the test, and it's a 5-section test. The first time he took it, he failed all 5 sections. He took it again. He failed 3 of the 5 sections.
Poor guy.
So he may not, as much as he wanted to be a pilot, he may not have had the aptitude to be a pilot.
Yeah.
Sounds like not. But
He had applied. He was trying to get his commercial license, which is why he was doing all of
Hours.
this flying on his own in Cessnas and small planes, because he wanted to get a commercial's license. For this particular flight, he was going to have to do what is called instrument-only flying. When you fly over land in the day, you can see the ground. You don't have to rely on your instruments as heavily. But when it's nighttime and or you're over the water, you're wholly dependent on using your instruments. He had never been in a situation where he had done instrument-only flying.
well,
So
yeah.
that's a knock against him.
Hopefully he'd been paying attention, though, to things like, there's things in the dashboard of your cockpit, like,
Well,
the
this is
artificial
true.
horizon and things like that.
This is
you know?
true, but there's a couple of other problems. Evidently, he was a bit of a maverick, not to make a Top Gun reference, but he was a bit of a maverick. He had been in trouble several times in an airplane, and by been in trouble, I mean he got in trouble with the Australian version of what we would consider in the United States the FAA. He had flown into restricted airspace before, which is a no-no.
Right.
And he had knowingly and intentionally flown into cloud banks, which is not a good idea in an airplane because you don't know if anybody else is coming, especially if you're on just kind of a training run. That is actually something that country will pursue, and legally you can get into some really big trouble. And they were investigating him for having pulled those stunts.
Yeah, and by the way, it's kind of a dumb thing to do. I mean, especially when you're a novice pilot, flying into a cloud is just not a good idea.
Yeah, no, it's not the smartest way to go about it, but okay, I remember being 20 and thinking that I had the world by its shorts.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I might have just assumed I'm so good, it's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Got him in the end is that when he went on this flight, it was in the evening. By the time he was heading out over the water, it was dusk. It was getting dark. It was late. So he didn't have a whole lot of visual cues to reference upon. So if he's not quite paying attention, he could have gotten himself into a spot of trouble. And we're going to actually listen to something that I found, which is a great thing for pilots in small craft. This is called 178 Seconds to Live, and it details how a pilot can quite quickly, in a situation where they can't see, get themselves into a lot of trouble and quite likely kill themselves. What we're about to listen to, is actually what happened to JFK Jr.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if anybody remembers, but it was,
yeah.
what was that, 8 years ago? It's been about that long, hasn't it? He crashed a Cessna, and they believe it was the same situation as we're going to listen to here in this little video.
Runway 35, clear for takeoff.
The sky is overcast and the visibility poor. That reported 8-kilometer visibility looks more like 3, and you can't judge the height of the cloud. Your altimeter says you're at 1,500 feet, but your map tells you there's local terrain as high as 1,200 feet. There might even be a tower nearby, because you're not sure just how far off course you are. But you've flown into worse weather than this, so you press on. You find yourself unconsciously easing back just a bit on the controls to clear those none-too-imaginary towers. With no warning, you're in the soup. You peer so hard into the milky white mist that your eyes hurt. You fight the feeling in your stomach. You swallow, only to find your mouth dry. Now you realize you should have waited for better weather. The meeting was important, but not that important. Somewhere a voice is saying, you should have turned back. You now have 178 seconds to live. Your aircraft feels on an even keel, but your compass turns slowly. You push your rudder pedal and add pressure to the controls to stop the turn. But this feels unnatural, so you quickly return the controls to their original position. That feels better. But now your compass is turning a little faster, and your airspeed is increasing slightly. You scan your instrument panel for help, but you don't find any. It all looks unfamiliar. You're sure this is just a bad spot. You'll break out in a few minutes. But you don't have a few minutes. You now have 100 seconds to live. You glance at your altimeter and are shocked to see it unwinding. You're already down to 1,200 feet. Instinctively, you pull back on the controls, but the altimeter still unwinds. The engine is into the red, and the airspeed's almost there too. You have 45 seconds to live. Now you're sweating and shaking. There must be something wrong with the controls. Pulling back only moves that airspeed indicator deep into the red. You can hear the wind tearing at the aircraft. You have 10 seconds to live. Suddenly, you see the ground. The trees rush up at you. You can see the horizon if you turn your head far enough, but it's at an unusual angle. You're almost inverted. You open your mouth to scream.
And that is the end.
Yeah, you have minus 10 seconds to live.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what this is saying is that, and it took me a couple of listens to really get a grasp on it because I've never flown a plane, but basically, and correct me, Joe, if you took this differently because I know you've listened to this one prior to today, is what's happening is a pilot is essentially going into a spin and diving downwards, getting inverted, and then going downwards. Is that how you understood this to be?
Yeah, essentially you can go, and I'm not sure if they're talking about going into a tailspin or just getting disoriented and inverting your plane. I think that's kind of what he was talking about.
It's inverted, and then you think that you're pulling back to go up, but you're driving.
But you're actually
down.
actually, and so that's why your altimeter continues to unwind even faster, even though you think you're trying to gain altitude, and you would think you would be losing airspeed, but suddenly instead you're losing altitude and gaining airspeed. So
something's wrong.
Yeah, and you would think, I mean, if you give the pilot long enough to think about it, you probably eventually figure it out and say, oh, you know what? I bet I'm upside down. And then,
but if you don't have that long to figure it out, that's the problem.
Okay.
So here's where this ties into the story.
Okay, I mean, I was just going to say, I don't know a whole lot about airplanes, but I do think that, don't these Cessnas have a fail-safe on that? Like, aren't they made to not be able to fly upside down for
extended periods of time?
Yeah.
You're correct. They do. Here's something that we haven't talked about so far in the recording from Frederick and the tower. Near the end, he reported the engine running rough. And that he was going to head towards the island to land because he was having engine trouble. It's thought that he may have become disoriented, inverted the plane, which was killing the engine. Now, this thing that he saw flying around him, it was reported to be an exceptionally still night. No wind, hardly any waves. There's been people who were there that night said it was kind of an unusual night. You could actually see the sky reflected in the ocean. So he may very well have been seeing his own reflection.
Was there a green light on that Cessna?
Cessnas do have colored lights on them. Yes, they have white and they have colored lights. So he may have been seeing his own reflection. So he was saying it was toying with him, and as he was turning, the reflection was going away. If you think about how the angle of the reflection would be. So it may have been that he had inverted his plane, and then, of course, that would kill the fuel supply. I do long for the plane to have been able to run inverted.
Right.
Yeah.
But
It's-
it's hard to say exactly what happened, but it's thought that that may be where the pilot error came in, is he may have flipped upside down and not known what was going on and tried to get out of there, and instead drove the plane into the sea.
Yeah, I guess my other problem with that is the sounds at the end of the recording.